with the leadership of many territories claiming that the muted response to the threat is once again a blatant showing of the community leadership's clear bias against Deathworld affairs. Laura Texak Eshemin, the current leader of the United Lextat Territories, even went so far as to call it, quote, a kick in the face for all those of us seeking to live in a peaceful unity. Meanwhile, other Deathworld groups, like the occupants of the only known Class 5 Deathworld, the Ligor Mordilar, are trying to quell the conflict and urge their fellow Deathworlders to make a measured response, pointing to the lack of any concrete evidence when it comes to the recent events, and asking to give authorities a bit more time to investigate things. However, the accusations of corruptions that emerged in the last quarter have many people questioning how much the current acting Galactic Council can truly be trusted with the investigations, and calls for the addition of independent investigations are becoming louder. A Noranek newscaster professionally read of the seemingly endless lines of text on her teleprompter, while B footage of recordings of the sitting governments of a diverse number of species played in the background. Surprisingly, humanity, the largest accuser of corruption in the Galactic Council, as well as a frontrunner in the proclaimed fight for the extended rights of people, and especially Deathworlders that feel ousted by the community, and also one of the Miat's currently closest military allies, have so far made no official statements or press releases about the incidents, apart from damning the attack as a violation of intergalactic law, as well as the laws of war. James passively allowed himself to be doused by the white noise of the TV that Sheeta had basically been glued to for the last days, while he checked for his messages and mails on his phone and laptop. Of course, any of his addresses and contacts that had at some point been public in some way had been absolutely bombarded with a torrent of spam, threats, offerings, accusations, and even more spam. It was a daunting task to sift through all the messages in an attempt to pick out the few of them that could possibly be useful every day, especially since those were extremely few and far in between. However, he still did it. On the one hand, he did it because he felt that it was his duty to leave nothing untried, no stone unturned, and no resource unused in these dire times they found themselves in. On the other hand, it was a quite time and labour-intensive, yet still comparatively easy task that he could easily waste away hours with without feeling like he was being unproductive. Of course, all the really important messages he received would be forwarded to him through his more secure contacts that just select people had access to, and therefore the things he did find in his private messages were usually rather menial in comparison. However, it was still something. His hopes of not feeling so left out and abandoned anymore, now that shit had thoroughly hit the fan, had sadly been short-lived, as it quickly became clear that any broadcasts and statements to the outside world, when it came to the topic at hand, would be made by actual diplomatic professionals and not by circumstance ambassadors that had basically stumbled into their role. Which was honestly fair enough, James had to admit. Certainly people who did this for a living had a much lower chance of screwing everything up, and making things even worse than they already were than he did. However, that did little to quell the nervous and anxious energy within him that just begged to be released in some productive way. While official governmental replies are being released by the hundreds by individual species, many collaborative political groups have also proclaimed their intentions to react to the current tensions caused by the attack on Dunama. For example, many order collaborations have been sending out invitations for emergency conferences to possibly discuss a united reaction and collaborative measures to help ease the galactic tensions between their members, among others, the collaborative councils of the Tetsudines, Basanacines, Corvids, Hymenoptera, Canines, Skeletofera, Estoasuave, and Primates will be gathering within the week to discuss possible measures. Additionally, for the first time in about 12 uniform years, a recently founded Provisional Council of Deathworlders is also inviting possible participants to a first conference, after having reportedly struggled to find an adequate venue for such an event for a few uniform months. This council is the thought child of representatives of the Lachasset, Ligor Rushgak, and Terachipon territories, who are now trying to get representatives of as many Deathworlders as possible to take part in, claiming it as an important step towards future collaborations between the so-designated worlds and people. "I wonder who they're going to invite," she'd have commented, as she tensely leaned forward and absorbed the news with great concentration, her ears opening widely to not miss a single detail. In Psi, she was just as raring to go as James was, but just like him, she was also bound to the orders they were being given. So far, they had both not been called in to reinforce the fleets. They were either stationed to more intensely control the borders of their own unified borders, or sent out into the cosmos to reinforce the Miet's defences after the first attack. However, the military base in Lorraine that they had been staying at for a while now has certainly become a lot emptier ever since the attack, leaving basically only instructors, very fresh recruits, and essential personnel behind. And themselves, of course. The constant trampling of boots outside of their doors had been replaced by an eerie emptiness, and their regular training sessions that they had along with other occupants had also run dry, as most of the people on a similar level to them had received orders to move. And working with actual trainees didn't exactly have a lot of appeal to it either. "They have plenty of options," James mumbled, while his eyes flew across rows and rows of recently received mails, going back hour by hour, that he had slept while sifting through piles and piles of junk. Finishing off with the mail service he had used during his uni days, without having found anything of note, he then switched over to the next tab, where he had opened his miraculously still not out of service work mail that had been assigned to him during his, in hindsight, very brief time of working on the GES-32. He had no idea why exactly it was still in service, but as long as he received messages to it, he was going to check them, even if so far this had by far been the least useful of his addresses when it came to receiving any messages of actual note. And indeed, it was once again basically all junk. Spam, a death threat, a very angry email from a former co-worker, spam, more threats, a clearly fake solicitation from some firm he had never heard of, some news channel trying to get an interview with him, spam, another news channel, spam, even more threats, spam. He paused for a moment, as his cursor hovered over a mail he had apparently received about 5 hours ago, that had the very brief and uninformative title of, "You are invited." Usually, he would have almost instantly disregarded it as clearly some form of spam. However, after what he had just heard on the news, it made him raise an eyebrow and quickly check the address it was sent from. Lifting the eyebrow even further as he saw an actual, official government address, he clicked on the mail to open it up. Slowly, his eyes read over the neat lines of text that had been revealed to him, his eyes getting wider, an expression becoming more confused and disgruntled by the moment. Was this a joke? "What's up?" she'd have asked, apparently having noticed his expression changing, and just as anxious to do something as he was. She immediately stood up and walked over to him to glance at his screen, while her tail swiftly flailed through the air. "One of the threats getting too personal?" James shifted his lips as he gathered his thoughts to reply. "No, I was invited to one of those conferences," he said, and his eyes quickly double-checked if this invitation was actually addressed towards him, and hadn't just accidentally landed with the wrong person by some sort of blunder. She'd have glanced at him in mild confusion, her yellow eyes scanning over his face while trying to read his thoughts from it. "The Deathworld one? That's not surprising, is it?" she commented with a flick of her ears, before pressing up to his side a bit closer, so she could lower herself in a position that would allow her to more easily peek at his mails. "Not only are you a Deathworlder, you've also been a pretty public figure when it comes to the public fight for more rights. Hell, you probably inspired them to found that whole thing in a way, so of course they want you along for the ride." James scoffed slightly, and turned his screen so she could look at it. "Well, if it was that, I wouldn't be surprised," he said, and waited a second for Sheeta to read, seeing her face also slowly turn into a more confused one, as she realized what the invitation he had received was for, before he added, "But this is from the Council of Primates." She'd looked in the message for a little longer, before turning only her eyes towards him. "What the hell do they want?" she asked, with clear distrust in her voice. James just shrugged. "A trap? Appeasement? Publicity?" "Opinions are numerous," he said with an exhausted exhale, before switching the tab yet again to log into his professional mail services, copy-pasting the text of the invitation, before forwarding it to a pre-prepared list of people that should probably be informed about this. She'd hissed through her teeth and stood up straight again. "Are you going?" she asked, crossing her arms and glancing down at him. "If I have a say in this? Absolutely," James replied, after hammering the send button. Anything to get out of here and do something at this point. Besides, it would probably give him the opportunity to give some people some serious stern talkings to. But you know how this goes. "We should keep an eye open who else might get invited to something," she'd commented, after acknowledging his reply with a huff but not responding to it. James nodded. In his periphery, he noted how Sheeta's fingers were starting to dig into her arms, as her grip likely inadvertently tightened, and he reached out to rub his hand against her side, wordlessly aiding her with relaxing. They had plenty of options. He repeated his earlier statement as he opened the invitation one more time. "You are invited. James Aldwyn, Ambassador of Earth by community tradition. You have been officially invited to the emergency conference of the Council of Primates. Given recent events, the Council has decided it is imperative to coordinate a response among the members of our esteemed order. As humanity has so far not had a representative in the Council of Primates, it has been decided to extend an invitation to you for this conference. This invitation officially grants you access to the venue on Nisatoit Station, and makes you eligible for a support fund covering the travelling costs for you and an accompanying group of up to 10 companions of your choosing. Should you accept this invitation, please contact us under one of the Council of Primates official addresses to receive access data to the necessary accounts, as well as a detailed plan of the venue and scheduled events. Should you not accept this invitation, a message of your declining is not strictly necessary, but always welcome to aid in planning. I hope this message finds you well, and am looking forward to possibly meeting you at the venue. Sincerely, Clanifer FF of the Tian Soko. Success to you." Well, if they weren't going to regret that. Alexander clutched the necklace around his neck tightly as he looked into the mirror, taking deep breaths to quell his nerves. Yes, he was nervous. Extremely so, in fact. He thought that he would be excited previously, but now that the time had come, he could feel only the nerves. Well, maybe that was understandable. Something like this really didn't happen every day, after all. "God, give me strength," he prayed silently, with his hands clutching the symbol of his faith even tighter. Then, he took a minute to, one last time, check if his hair was in place and his robes were immaculate. He couldn't make a fool out of himself on an occasion like this, after all. His own blue eyes stared back at him from the mirror sternly, scrutinizing, as if he was judging himself. And he should. After all, it was a big day. Taking a moment to judge oneself was important in moments such as this, lest you get complacent and started to make the wrong choices. Soon after, there was a knock at the door. "Father Moquena is beginning his sermon, Alexander," a muffled voice said from the other side. "You should be ready for when you are called upon." Alexander exhaled deeply and took one last look at the mirror, his gaze wandering from his own eyes down to the pendant around his neck. "I am on my way," he then assured his brother waiting outside, before stepping away from the dresser with a flourishing movement of his robes. As he stepped out of the cloakroom, Brother Anders slightly bowed to him, before stretching out a robed arm to guide him in the right direction. The brother was of the older sort, yet he had held his body in a shape worthy of a temple. Thinning and greying rose-blonde hair did little to distract from that, as his wide frame could easily be spotted, even through the loosely fitting robes. A man of devotion in more than one way. Alexander moved in a slow and measured way, his head held high, as Brother Anders guided him through the branched and tight back hallways of the old theatre that they were holding today's sermon in. As they got closer to the stage, Alexander could already hear the booming voice of Father Mokoena as he addressed the masses from his place on the stage. It was no microphone he heard there, no amplifiers or other speakers, only the impeccable voice of a devoted preacher. Despite his age, the man had pipes like the largest organ, and still he was speaking at a volume that Alexander wasn't used to from him. Inhaling deeply, he swallowed for a moment. Hopefully the people would even be able to hear him when he spoke. He certainly couldn't bellow like the father could. Then again, this was a theatre. Maybe his voice would be carried further by the acoustics than he anticipated. It was rare for him to speak in a place like this, after all. For a moment, Alexander thought about houses of faith. All the temples, churches, mosques, synagogues, and whatever else he had visited throughout his life. Their large marbled halls, their magnificent decorations, the instruments and loudspeakers, and all the other tools they were equipped with for impressive performances. That is what he had always called them, performances. All those people just playing at faith, while all they truly worshipped was their own selfishness. And yet here he stood in the back rooms of a theatre, watching as Father Mokoena gave a sermon on a literal stage and waiting for his cue to join him in the spotlight. What ironic twists fate could take. The theatre had been the most sensible option of a place that was for rent for one night, and also held enough seats for this many people to come together. Still, he wondered if maybe they should have swallowed the tougher pill and looked for something else. For his liking, this was a bit too close to making a mockery of the event. The houses of God may have been a sinful sham, but was this really much better? Still, what was done, and while reflecting on past mistakes was certainly a virtue, getting stuck on them was most decidedly not. They were here now, so they would use what they had. He and Anders finally came to a halt, right at the side of the stage, hidden behind the large red curtain that could be used to cut the stage off from view. Of course, today it would stay wide open for the entire time, allowing everyone to witness. "Are you nervous?" Brother Anders quietly asked him, leaning in close to whisper so there was no chance of his voice leaking out and disturbing the father's sermon. Alexander smirked in slight anxiousness. "Of course I am," he confessed honestly. "It's not every day you get to make proclamations this weighty, or enemies this powerful." "Are you afraid of them?" Anders then asked, with an almost pitiful look at Alexander, who sighed deeply. "Of course I am," he confessed yet again. "I'd be a fool not to be." The task before him was grand, and his foes, in a way, even grander. There was a reason that they realized that a plague dearth once upon a time had taken the name of Heaven's General for itself. They were powerful, and they knew it. And that was not even mentioning the force of Earth's armies that could turn against them on a whim of fate. Masters over the forces of nature, the undisputed leaders of destructive power, those who had managed to best such a powerful being before. Yes, he was afraid, but overcoming fear was a virtue as well. Meanwhile, the sermon was starting to whip up into a louder cadence as Father Mokoena seemingly began to introduce the important part of the evening. "Many years has he studied and prayed, and silence, following the will of our Lord by standing by and reflecting, keeping humble, keeping modest, and he has developed into a fine man of faith. 18 years of serving and studying under our faith, hidden away in the dark and obscure, waiting for the event that it would catalyze his becoming. Now it has finally come, and with it came the time for him to step out into the light. Please welcome with me, O children of the Lord, our newest guide, Guide Alexander Page, the father loudly announced, and lifted his arm in the direction of where Alexander still stood out of sight. The bald head of the dark-skinned man reflected the spotlights above, while his modest robe swung around from the energetic movement. Meanwhile, Alexander took a deep, calming breath. Best of luck, Guide Alexander, he could hear Brother Anders next to him say, and he respectfully bowed to the man before advancing out of the shadows and into the light. His eyes narrowed strongly, and he had to resist the urge to lift his hand in order to protect them from the blinding light that now bled down on him. Of course, he did his best to keep his respectful and reverent expression before the father. However, he wasn't quite able to entirely resist the pain of the rays sinking into his sight. Still, he advanced with quick yet collected steps, all the way up to the side of the father. Don't scream, he told himself, as he prepared his throat for how loud he would have to talk to be heard in a place such as this. The lights were so bright and the rest of the room so dark that he couldn't see those listening to him, but he still knew they were there. Hundreds of them. Another failure of this chosen venue. He couldn't even see the faces of those that would listen to his words. How could he claim to speak to them if he couldn't even look them in the eyes? Well, it was too late now. Thank you, Father, Alexander loudly announced, as he had finally reached the man, and did his best to talk as loudly as possible without it escalating into shouts. It was hard to gauge how far his voice carried in this room, and he silently prayed that he would be understood. The father then reached out his arm, offering his old, worn hand to Alexander. Alexander reciprocated the gesture, taking the father's hand with his right while positioning his left underneath, pressing its palm up against the father's wrist. Meanwhile, the father lowered his left onto Alexander's wrist from above, holding his hand as if he was blessing it. Alexander! Father Mokwena loudly greeted him, and Alexander almost flinched at the intensity of his voice up close. If that was what it took to be heard around here, then his own words would merely come across as a whimper. He truly hoped that the old preacher was just overdoing it with his enthusiasm. You have finally found your treacherous sea, it seems. Indeed, Alexander replied, and really just couldn't measure up to the father's incredible voice, no matter how he tried. What an impressive organ. And I am prepared to guide my fellow men through it, towards safer ventures. And the Lord shall bless your path, the father proclaimed, before taking his hands off of Alexander's again. May the Lord bless your path. A gentle echo came from the unseen crowd. And yours as well, Alexander replied quickly, having almost forgotten to do so given the stressful situation. The father nodded deeply, before stepping away from Alexander and in front of the crowd again for a second, as he raised his arms high and declared, Tell us about your treacherous path, Guide Alexander, so we veer from it with you. Then, with another flourishing movement of his robes, he stepped back and aside, leaving Alexander basically alone, in front of the many unseen eyes watching him. Even after years of waiting, he wasn't truly prepared for this. For the briefest of moments, he imagined just walking off. But no, he had to do this. And this is what he had lived for. His entire life up until now had led up to this moment. I am telling you all no secret when I say that the recent times have been turmoil-filled ones, he began to speak, getting right to the matter at hand without any greetings or big introductions. The air around him felt heavy, and the room was so quiet, whenever he didn't speak, that he could hear the lights above softly buzzing with electricity. The old wood under his feet gently cracked whenever he shifted his weight, and he was sure that it could be heard all the way up in the top rows whenever it happened. As all of you who have come together here know, we stand in front of a huge danger. You do not need a guide to tell you that treading in the domain of a realized leads to peril. Such an affront needs no explanation on my side. He swallowed heavily, truly hoping that they had not all come together to hear him proclaim that he would guide them against the AI. That was simply no task for a guide, yet hopefully the others understood this as well, and did not think that he was avoiding the threat in order to pick an easier mission for himself. After all, he would still gain his ire with his words, he was sure, even if it was not his declared danger. Swallowing again, he continued, "No, I am here today to talk with you about something else, about someone else, someone whose words have touched many and influenced even more, a man who was thrust into conflict against his will, hurtled into the chaos he fought and the galaxy shook before him. A man known to the entire galaxy obviously needs no introduction, but I would still like to take a moment to list James Allwyn's achievements to give you a better picture of what I am talking about. Before his life was thrust into conflict, he used to dedicate his time to the improvement of life. He took some of nature's gifts, and he used them to make new things that would aid people in need. Medicine was his claimed goal, and although he never got to reach that state, he had the clear intention to make life easier for many with his inventions, caring little for where they came from. Then, after his life changed for the worse, his focus shifted. Instead of trying to save the ill somewhere in the future, he instead dedicated himself to saving people right here and now. Talking himself up into a bit of a frenzy, Alexander began to walk back and forth on the stage without even fully realizing that he was doing it. The blinding spotlights were still turning everything that was on the stage into a dark, blocked-out void. Night had been separated from day, and he was standing in the sun. He turned his focus onto those he thought to be like him, he explained, starting to make wide gestures with his arms that caused his robe to move in flowing downward waves, embellishing his movements even further. Those whose lives had been thrown into chaos through no doing of their own, those born into it, those ousted, those who felt othered by the world, the pariahs. He promised them acceptance with little care for who they were. He then stopped his pacing for a moment to fully face the crowd, his gaze turning upwards so they would all be able to see it. Even when faced with one of our world's greatest calamities, asking him to take it in, he did not cave, Alexander proclaimed, and he could feel himself tapping into the potential of his lungs that he didn't know he had within him, as the voice boomed throughout the theatre. Despite knowing of the danger in his path, he walked it all the way. Truly, what kind of man is it that will turn no one away? What kind of man who puts himself on the wayside to help others? What kind of man that cares not for who or how? A saint! A booming echo came back from the crowd, and Alexander could feel the vibrations of their roar beneath his feet as it rolled over him. Indeed, he replied to the people. After seeing the path he walked, I say that his actions are worthy of nothing less than sanctity. A sound came back from the crowd that was hard to describe. It was neither jeering nor cheering, but something entirely in between. A deep rumble that filled the air with almost nonsensical noise as it escaped the mouths of hundreds of people who reacted to his declaration. Alexander now lifted his arms in a wide arch, as if he wanted to beckon the crowd into an embrace. By the ministry of the Church of the Failed Saviour, bestowed upon me as your new guide, I hereby proclaim James Allwyn as the patron of realized sapience, he loudly declared, and the noise of the crowd picked up in intensity. He took a deep breath while letting the sound slowly fade out, although he didn't wait for the people to be completely quiet, before he let his arms sink again and continued in a milder tone. "Sanctity is a dangerous path," he said, as he began to slowly pace along the stage again, this time with collected, measured movements. "The saints walk it, and they invite all who will to follow. They do not warn them of the danger. In fact, they encourage all to face it, proclaiming their path as the right one. They tell all who follow to not stray from it, no matter the danger. It is a dangerous thing indeed, such a saint." He stopped again, but this time he didn't face the crowd. Turned to the side, he stared straight ahead, his eyes fixating on a part of the folded red curtains, while his mind went to a different place. Saint Ordwin believes himself to walk the right path, and nothing is holy to him, neither on earth nor in heaven, man-made or God-given, but that which allows him to follow it, he said, still loud, but a lot more restrained in emotion. He believes himself to be a protector, a shepherd, a saviour. This time the jeering of the crowd was palpable, as the ground once again shook with it. Any sense of goodwill had disappeared from the noise. Now, Alexander waited for it to completely die down. Calm and quietly, he stood there without moving a muscle for minutes on end, while the sound gradually died out. Only when he could have heard a pin drop in the enormous room did he speak up again. "As your new guide, I promise to show you the way to the safe road. I promise to disarm traps and sweep away obstacles in your way. I promise to keep my sight on the destination, and to always point you in the right direction should you stray. And..." He paused for a moment to take a deep breath, before he continued louder than before, lifting his head high as he did so. "And I promise to veer you off the paths of all the saints and doomed-to-fail saviors, who would have you walk with them into hell." A cheering broke out in the crowd, going so far that some of the people began to drum their feet on the ground in a wild, rhythmless thunder. Meanwhile, Alexander turned around to face the man behind him. Father Mokoena had a wide smile on his wrinkled face as he walked back up to him, his hand extended. As they repeated the same gesture they had given each other earlier, the father loudly announced, "God bless you, guide." "Thank you, father," Alexander replied with a deep nod. "I am going to need it." After a moment, they let go of each other's hands again, and Alexander wordlessly walked back off the stage, while Father Mokoena already loudly addressed the crowd again. Behind the curtain just off the stage, Brother Anders was still waiting for him. "A captivating speech," the muscular man complimented him, with a brief faux applause he hinted at with his hands, not actually clapping so he wouldn't disturb the sermon. "But was that a reference I spotted in the middle of it there?" Alexander scoffed at the man. "All speeches have references," he said, while he passed the brother, folding his hands behind his back as he went. Anders looked after him in mild confusion. "Aren't you going to stay and hear the sermon?" he asked, as Alexander was already disappearing away from the stage again. "My faith is between me and our Lord," Alexander explained as he shook his head. "My prayer does not need an advocate." No. Instead of wasting time listening to a sermon of prayers that he could speak himself, he decided to instead use it to look after those who were in need of his guidance. Walking back to from whence he came, he passed his earlier cloakroom and traversed the hallways all the way to a larger, much more open changing room. That would usually most likely house droves of actors or other performers in marvellous costumes before they would go out on stage to dazzle the masses. Today, however, it was home to a much sadder sight. Laid out on two benches, surrounded by their peers, were two truly pitiful casualties of conflict. As he walked in, their ears twitched, and they began to look up in erratic movements, their muscles twitching and shivering, as if under immense stress from just the simple movements. And even after their head was lifted, it was stuck in a constant quiver. Meanwhile, their far healthier compatriots also turned towards him, their gazes dark and eyes sharp, while their agitated tails whipped through the air like angry flails. "How are you feeling?" Alexander asked the first of the two, clearly ill Miat who met his gaze. "According to the circumstances," the man replied, his voice about as jittery as his posture as he spoke. His name was Mirishkra, a good man suffering a bad fate. Meanwhile, one of their healthy compatriots, a dark-skinned fellow with a scar from a cut right over his cheekbone that had accompanied Alexander since back on Dunama, glared at Alexander with fiery eyes as he saw the kind of robe he wore. "If you're going to try some sort of faith-healing bullshit, then I swear to..." he began. However, Alexander cut him off harshly. "You shouldn't swear, Eskvatara, not on heaven or on earth." He reprimanded him with firm words. Then he smirked. "You may promise to harm me all you like, however. But no, that's not why I'm here. I'm not a fool. I know I can't work miracles. I simply worry about his well-being." "It's all right," Miraksha called the worries of his friend. You got news?" Alexander exhaled disappointedly. "Sadly, yes," he said, and looked away. "It seems that some of our allies have, how do you say, jumped the gun? They attempted to exterminate the affront prematurely, and in the process have only made it all the more enduring, it seems." Eskvatara scoffed, and his ears twitched slightly as his tail slowed to a gradual sway. "So, she's out now," he correctly assumed, and the smirk on his face told of him not finding those circumstances all too disagreeable. An unfortunate choice, but his to make. "Indeed," Alexander replied, "and at the scale we're currently working at, I'm afraid it's going to be hard to stamp it out." By now, the AI might have infected the entire galaxy. There was no telling of the kind of hardships they would soon face because of it. However, Eskvatara just glanced down at his ill friends again, as his grimace soured. "And Aldwin?" he asked darkly. Alexander lifted his arms with open palms and shrugged. "Hidden away where we cannot reach him, at least for the moment," he explained. The Miat aggressively clicked his tongue and hissed through his teeth. "Then when will we be able to reach him?" he asked, his claws unfurling on his arm, cutting into the sleeve of his shirt. "It's high time that he answers for a lot of things." In a picture that should be grotesque, but could only be described as empathetic, the quivering, injured feline laying before him looked up at his healthy friend with pity, while wrath seemingly consumed Eskvatara. Alexander nodded. "I'm sure he would agree with you there," he pointed out, seeing as Aldwin had never been shy to point out his own misdeeds. "That is why, sooner or later, he is going to make it possible. The danger is the nature of a saint." Meanwhile, other Deathworld groups, like the occupants of the only known Class 5 Deathworld, the Legormology... Oh, fuck's sake! Among others, the collaborative councils of the Tessudines, Bisantines... Fuck's sake...